Good morning, everyone. My name is Damian Garcia. I'm a third-year chemical engineering student at the University of Florida. I'm also the team leader for the Pesceponiks.
My name is Julian. I am a sophomore at the University of Florida in biomedical engineering.
Hi, my name is Bulnes. I'm a junior mechanical engineering student at University of Florida as well.
Okay, well, before we begin to enter into the details of our proposed solution, it's helpful to consider the historical context in which it arose, in which the problem we're attempting to solve arose. Okay, well, before the Castro Revolution, the agricultural sector was mostly dominated by the production of sugar and the export of sugar to the United States. And there was a favorable relationship between the United States and the Cuban economy at the time. But because there was such a reliance on the export of sugar, the economy was very sensitive to exogenous factors. It was a monoculture system, and there was large import of food goods. After the Castro Revolution, initially, there was a push towards the retaking of the Cuban countryside and a slight push towards diversification, but it had to be abandoned. Then the government entered the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance with the Soviet bloc, and more of the pre-revolutionary trade structure perpetuated itself. Also, there was the emergence of Soviet-style farming and national state farms. Then certain important developments occurred that led to what was known as el periodo especial. There was an inadequacy in the production of the state farms, and actually there has been research done that shows that some of the non-state sector farms were actually more productive during this time. The disintegration of the Soviet bloc caused a total collapse of the trade system. Imports of oil decreased dramatically, and also petrochemicals, which are often used as fertilizers. Stringent economic sanctions then followed from the United States, causing a drastic reduction in the size of the Cuban economy, the GDP. Animal feed also plummeted, which affected the livestock production.
So as you can imagine, the Cuban people were not exactly satisfied with the effects of the special period, and therefore there was a reaction to it. Because of this lack of resources, Cuban people tended to be more innovative. They created this sort of necessity for goods and for energy and for actual inputs. And this led to invention and innovation. So because there was no fuel, no energy, like I said, people were thinking, what is it that I do? What is it that the people that I look to for guidance, specifically the government, they were sort of clueless as to how to address the issue of people's wants and needs. So Cuban people started using these empty areas, these currently empty areas like empty parking lots, empty factories, empty backyards, even rooftops, to start planting these organic gardens. And because there was also a lack of fertilizers, lack of petrochemicals, lack of pesticides, most of this gardening was done organically. And you get this sort of blend of people using soils and whatever they can find to create a garden. Also, the Cuban government happened to take notice and sort of piggybacked on the Cuban people's innovative nature. And they designed these things called lineamientos, which are actually guidelines for how the Cuban economy should proceed. And because this was already being done, people were already motivated to begin anew, to start moving forward. The lineamientos pretty much stood as, this is what we're going to do, instead of this is what should be done. Number 174 specifically said this should be distributed throughout the country. So from this arises these co-ops and these farms that people create, and the government had registered over 67 hectares of land in Cuba and created this mechanism called the Organoponico. The Organoponico has raised beds with ample amount of organic matter that is constructed from some soil disposal and other organic matter that was called worm humus or worm paste. It sounds fairly gross, but it really is just the mashing of this nutrients, and it creates this sort of organic fertilizer. And then you also need ample sunlight and crop management in order for photosynthesis to occur, and obviously to regulate soil and organic matter deposits. So as you can see here, this was an empty parking lot before, and people just began taking parts of their garden, parts of their home, and created these sort of bed tops. This is in the middle of a neighborhood in Havana. And you also get a lot of jobs that stem from this Organoponico co-ops. You have over 400,000 people employed. Specifically, I've looked at the Vivero a la Mar Organoponico in Havana, which employs over 163 people, and it has a broad range of ages, any range from around 12 years old to even people well in their 80s that are compliant with this. And you get a lot of benefits out of organic growth. You get a healthy and green populace. You get also this sort of this sense of independence of the people, which, as the society begins to privatize itself some more, is definitely a step towards a little bit more of a capitalist society, though this was not a political motion. Some challenges do arise. This is not without challenges. You have scarcity in soil, the organic matter production. It takes skilled and knowledgeable workers, which are not always present to create this organic matter. You also have a depletion of arable land. So some of the land and natural fertilizers is another issue that could occur. Although the organic matter is a great fertilizer, it is not in abundance. And then the yields from the Organoponico are not exactly great. You have a lot of it is, it makes up only about 33% of Cuba's rationed foods, which is, in a sense, very small compared to how much Cuba imports and exports on agricultural goods. You also have complacency of people. The research and innovation that goes into this is minimal, specifically because people think, well, we already have this, what's the need to improve? So you get this sort of halting of academic research that's oriented towards this. Now, this is what a modern Organoponico looks like in the center of Havana. This is actually the Vivero a la Mar in Organoponico. And as you can see, these raised beds are far, far longer. And these are some of the vegetables that you can produce using some of these raised beds. So our problem occurs here. Organoponics cannot keep up with agricultural production demands of, an ever-growing and globalizing world. You have a small percentage, as I said before, of the food actually stems from the Organoponics. And they still import a majority of their goods from places like France, Germany, and even Spain and Portugal. So this has given Raul Castro an opportunity to segue. He's, like I said before, sort of piggybacking on his people's innovative nature. And he's deciding to give the private sector a more, like a fortified role, specifically because he's realizing that a lot of the private sector seems to do things a little bit more productively. And this involves an adaptation of a top-down industrial method, which is what most companies employ nowadays here in the United States. Our belief is that adopting the norm could actually be a detriment to Cuba, specifically because they're at a pivotal moment. They've reached a moment where they can actually slightly experiment with their design. And the sustainability and strength of this design is actually what we're aiming for. We aim to actually take a proactive approach, whereas you predict long-term rewards versus short-term and potential consequences. So this comes to our proposed solution to the problem. This is aquaponics. Aquaponics is a mixture of aquaculture and hydroponics, where aquaculture involves fisheries, fish breeding, aquariums, much like displayed in our design here, where you breed fish in a tank. Then you also get the mixture of hydroponics, which are raised beds of soil, of solution instead of soil used for planting. So you place the plants in a sort of bed of rich in water and several other nutrients, majority of them minerals, and you can actually grow these plants directly out of a bed. Now, the symbiotic nature of this relationship is mutual because you have fish that produce effluent from fish feed. And this effluent produces very rich nutrients that can actually act as fertilizer for the plants. And as these plants actually take up the nutrients, it acts as sort of a biofilter. So you can run on a relatively low amount of water and still get this natural flow. And because the biofilter tends to cleanse the water, you can use that same water to populate your fish tank. Now, something that you really, really, really need for this sort of mechanism is immense amounts of energy. Energy is one of the greatest inputs of one of this thing. But this aquaponic design that we're going to show you actually runs on very, very low energy. So how does it work? Like I've said, you're responsible for the fish feed. Assuming that you have a good fish feed consisting of either algae, chum, or any fish feed that can be found at a store and you buy it in bulk, it has ample nutrients that the fish effluent can actually transfer and become nutritional for the plants. Then the fish waste composition, as stated before, if you buy the appropriate foods, you get ammonia, nitrogen-rich gases, magnesium sulfate, calcium, and like I've said before, it acts as a great solution for the plants. Now, what you need, like I said before, is pumps and blowers. This is what causes the circulant flow of your entire project, and it allows for the symbiotic relationship to occur. Has it been done before? And yes, it has. That is the greatest benefit to this. It has been done in a tropical region in the U.S. Virgin Islands by a professor named Dr. James E. Rakosi. Dr. James E. Rakosi is sort of the guru of this entire movement of aquaponics. He has performed a lot of research. Many research papers have been written by him, and he runs an aquaponics journal through his consulting firm. Now, the specific one that he has done only occupies 0.05 hectares of land, which is 0.1 acres. And the main point that I want to emphasize here is that you have 10 nutrients supplied by the fish effluent, and basically just base additions as the rest of your treatment. And you only have about 3 of them, so you need calcium dioxide, dihydroxide, potassium hydroxide, and chelated iron. Now, you also need aeration for fish, degassing, clarifying and solids removal, and a sump. And this would require a lot of, just not a lot of space, but a lot of technical knowledge. So we can integrate this system in actually the education of the Cuban people. So this is a model of our aquaponics, of the aquaponic system that is already in place in the United States Virgin Islands. You have fish breeding tanks, and then you have base addition tanks that render that part of the inflow. And upstream, you also have the degassing tanks, and then it moves the effluent into the hydroponic beds. And you also have return lines stemming from other hydroponic beds, which lead right back into the fish rearing tanks. This is an example of, this is the exact, this is the real version of the schematic that I've just shown you. As you can see, the beds are fairly long, a lot like the Organoponico, and they also have a lot of plant, like a high concentration of plants per square meter. These are the fish rearing tanks. here in the fish rearing tanks, it looks like there's a lot of clutter of fish, but this is simply because there's netting that is grasping the fish as we speak. And here you have the beginnings of of the spice of basil. And this is what the end product is in a 24-week cycle. So one of the things I wanted to discuss very quickly is the yields. You have aquaponics, you have the aquaponic bed producing about 3 times as much annual yield of the basil, which is very formidable, very low energy, which my colleague is going to explain, and you have far less room taken up by the aquaponic.
Next, we're going to discuss how much would this cost to implement. We'll base our cost analysis model on the University of Virgin Islands system, and then take it to a 24-unit model where the image shown is a single unit. This is a breakdown of the cost for it was based on lettuce, but that is also going to be comparable cost for tomato, basil, parsley, oregano, many varieties of herbs, cabbage. In the total cost for the initial part would be slightly under $9,000 with a very low depreciation rate. And then for the fish rearing tanks and the tilapia growing aspect of the system, the total initial cost would be $14,000 for purchasing the tanks, the blowers, the netting, circulating pumps, the various components which go into growing the fish. And then we went on to do an analysis of the capital investment for the entire 24-unit model. So based on the previous 2 tables, you would have a combined $500,000 for the initial setup, and then also there are additional costs such as purchasing the fingerlings, which are the smaller fish, so then they continue to breed inside the tanks, the greenhouses, and then also you need to pay for the rainwater collection to attain the water. However, the system obviously it circulates the water, so don't need to worry about replacing the water frequently at all. And that comes to a total capital investment of slightly over $1 million for a 24-unit system capable of producing over 100,000 kilograms of tilapia in an annual basis. And then these are the continuous operating costs. The greatest expenses are the labor. Each unit will employ about 21 people, with 16 of them being laborers and the other 5 being sort of specialists who are very familiar with the system, the chemical composition of the water, plant taming, and those types of things required to maintain the system at optimal growing. This is a display for the tilapia production. And next is the environmental impact. As Damian stated earlier, it's a very small impact. Obviously, the need for agricultural equipment is eliminated with this system, so do not need to burn up fuel. And as the world is approaching peak oil very soon, this is a very large concern. And wastewater is obviously limited because the system can reuse the water over and over again. And also each individual unit only requires 3 horsepower. So that comes to a total of 70 horsepower for the 24-unit model. Half of that energy is for the blowers and the other half is for the pump to cause the circulation. And also as far as environmental pollutants go, there's just a degassing process which comes as a result of accumulation of larger particulates on the netting from the fish. And then we'll go on to nutrition.
Because we have very little time, I'd like to say that the Cuban diet has several deficiencies: iron, a few vitamins, and the increase in vegetable production, and fruit production will increase that availability, and possibly improve the diet, decrease obesity and cardiovascular disease. So these are just symbols of what we have, and then what we want, right? Yeah. Okay, and the implementation that we seek to the model that we seek to follow is a location in a place with a very stable energy source. So most likely a tourist center that has a strong grid because the system does require consistent input of energy. Now, this has been done before. I mean, there's a certain cultivo protegido system of organopónicos that supplies very high-quality vegetables for tourists, such that more hard currency is brought into the economy, and this will work in the same fashion, bringing in the hard currency, and that can be reinvested in improving the electrical infrastructure of neighboring communities, and individuals that work at our aquaponic system will gain the knowledge and the expertise to then create a similar system in the surrounding communities where they most likely live, and thus improve the food security of those areas. And that is the end of the presentation.
I just want to say one thing. We had a term that we used and coined to talk about how the larger scale, like the long-term approach to this, was to have a sort of engineered trickle-down was the term that we used, where you start out with implementing this into tourist areas, and eventually the market revenue from this can be used to regenerate even privatized forms of the aquaponic.